Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast. I'm Matt Fleming. I'm PRI's Director of Communications. I'm joined by Lance Izumi, PRI's Senior Director of Education Studies. And our special guest today is Ben Austin, who is the Founding Director of Education Civil Rights Now, a national nonprofit with the mission of establishing a constitutional right to a high-quality public education for children in multiple states across the country. Lance and Ben, how are you guys doing today?
Great to be here with you guys.
Great to be your co-host today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having a great discussion about education and education reform today. And Ben, we mentioned that you are the founding director of Education Civil Rights Now, which we will get to what you're up to at that organization in a minute. But first, the way I found out about you and became familiar with your work was through Parent Revolution, which is no longer exists. It might actually exist. I don't know that for sure, but it no longer exists in the capacity it once did. You're certainly no longer there. But when it first founded and when I became familiar with it was you were pushing for legislation which became known as the Parent Trigger Law that gave parents in failing schools options to hold school districts accountable for performance. It was a great law. We connected recently talking about it, but I'd love it if you could just briefly sort of, for our listeners who are unfamiliar with that law, kind of walk us through what it was, the challenges you faced getting it into law, and where it stands now.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks again for inviting me to be part of your podcast. The Parent Trigger Law was passed by one vote in both houses of the California legislature in December 2009 and signed into law by then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in January in 2010. And what it effectively said was that if you're a parent trapped in a systemically failing school, and as you and Lance both know, some of these schools have been failing not just for years, but literally for generations. And, as you all also both know, the education bureaucracy in California, for the most part, has just stood on the sideline and watched this generational failure and watched with not too much curiosity about the carnage for children and families that's resulted from it. And so what the Parent Trigger said was that we're not going to stand and watch anymore. And specifically, we're going to empower public school parents with a seat at the table to advocate for the interests of all children. What that specifically meant operate in terms of the way it operationalized was that if a school had been failing for more than, I believe it was 5 years, it became eligible for the parent trigger. And that meant that if half the parents at that school signed a petition, it gave them a lot of power. It gave them power to either bring in new staff, to change around the leadership of the school, to convert their school into a nonprofit charter school, or to do what probably about half the parents did with parent trigger campaigns, which was to collect all the signatures they needed, but not turn them in, and instead go back to the school district and say, look, guys, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, but we have power now. You have to pay attention to us now. You have to effectively treat us like you treat other powerful special interests in California. And so instead of us effectively firing you, why don't we sit down and talk about how to make our school work for our children? And it gave parents the ability to basically unionize the same way other members of society are able to organize and unionize. And as you wrote about, Matt, that was quite a controversial concept. It brought out a lot of haters, a lot of opponents, and a lot of proponents. I'm played in a mediocre movie by Maggie Gyllenhaal as the result of it.
So where does the law stand now?
The status quo forces in California, led by the California Teachers Association, were not big fans of the law. They were not big fans of me. I'm certainly not on their holiday card mailing list. For some time, they tried to figure out how to oppose it, how to organize parents in the beginning stages of the law. You and I talked about this, Matt. The first parent trigger campaign was in Compton, California, and we wrote the law so that undocumented parents could sign the petition. And CTA, which purports to care about undocumented parents, we literally had to go to court to get an injunction to prevent them from threatening parents with deportation for signing a parent trigger petition at their child's school. These were the kinds of tactics that the status quo used to defend what we thought was an indefensible status quo. And, the tactics evolved. They got a little bit more refined. But at the end of the day, I think that special interests that were benefiting from the status quo were not big fans of having to have that, debate in the first place. And so I believe it was in 2015, you wrote about it in your piece, Matt. They quietly passed a law that effectively said, look, parent trigger applies to failing schools in California. And so we're just going to kind of by legislative fiat get rid of failing schools. And they defined away what constituted a failing school. So, there are a whole bunch of low quality schools in California, schools that none of us would send our own children to. But by definition, under California law, they're no longer failing. And so the parent trigger doesn't apply to any of them.
And I'll tell you this, the California Teachers Association has never sent me a Christmas card either.
So maybe we can have Christmas together, Lance.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. Well, that which brings me to my question. You and I, with a few others, have been in the education reform movement for many years together in California, and it can be sometimes a lonely road. But the parent trigger law was a huge victory for you and for the reform movement. And given what happened as you described, what is it kind of your big takeaway? What have you learned from that whole experience?
I think a couple of things. I think first of all, everybody on all sides of this debate, on all sides of the political spectrum, says that they support parent empowerment, parent engagement, parent involvement. But one of the lessons I learned, and this doesn't just apply to CTA, I would say it applies to quote unquote our side as well, that people generally support parent involvement, parent engagement, and parent empowerment up to the point where parents are doing exactly what they want them to do. Whether it is kind of submit to an indefensible status quo, or whether it's to choose to convert your school into a charter school. Either way, whether the three of us agree or disagree with that kind of ideological perspective doesn't really matter in the context of parent empowerment. What really matters is what do the parents want? And there's not a big constituency to authentically support that on the left or the right. In my opinion. And so that was one takeaway, is that parent empowerment is really, really popular until you scratch about a centimeter below the surface, and it gets really, really complicated in all directions. The second takeaway, which is maybe a little bit more global, is that Lance, like you said, like you and I have been like in the trenches for quite some time. And, outside of education, we can talk about the broader kind of capital P politics. We may or may not agree on certain things, but we see eye to eye on a lot of stuff in the education lane. And it occurred to me that we're all kind of going to Vegas trying to win against the house if we're trying to get this big, bulking education bureaucracy to serve the interests of children, because children aren't allowed to vote and parents don't have lobbyists. So here we are. I had this really interesting experience in the middle of the parent trigger fight where Governor Schwarzenegger appointed me to the State Board of Education. Lance, I think you and I were in touch back then. And it was a funny way that it happened, because I not only didn't know Governor Schwarzenegger, I was actually a paid staffer on his opponent's campaign. I worked on Phil Angelidis' campaign against him. And he liked the parent trigger and decided to appoint me to the state board. And so I think because of that, because I wasn't a politician and I didn't cash in political chits, I think I treated it a lot differently than I would have, a lot less preciously, I guess, than if I was like a politician. And so I kind of casually announced on my first day that I was going to try to cast every vote as if it directly affected my daughters. And I invited the reporters in the room to play gotcha with with me about it, to call me out if they felt like I wasn't doing that. And over time, it became really actually a helpful North Star. It was surprisingly helpful because when you're not a politician, you're not used to like quote unquote casting votes, to thinking like that, especially about technocratic policy that I haven't thought deeply about. And so it was like a really helpful North Star. But what I quickly figured out was that there was literally no constituency for that. I ended up pissing off everybody. And after about a year, I really had very little political support and got removed from the State Board of Education on Jerry Brown's first day in office, and replaced by the chief lobbyist for the California Teachers Association, who I believe still holds that seat. So it's a long answer to your short question, Lance, but I think that my biggest takeaway was that public education system is rigged in a way that, other areas of public policy are not. Like the dude who runs the Social Security Administration doesn't have, politicians banging down their door to repeal Social Security because older people vote, AARP exists, et cetera. And in most areas of public policy, democratic incentive structures generally push towards coherent public policies. But the idea of getting an education, big, gigantic, expensive education bureaucracy, anachronistic education bureaucracy, to serve the interest of a constituency that has no power by definition. I had a Democratic state senator in California tell me once that he sees public schools as big buildings filled with people who can't vote for him. And I think that kind of says it all when you're talking about why we are the way we are and why generations after you and I met, Lance, the education system still looks pretty much the same.
Just released from Encounter Books, read the new book from PRI's Sally Pipes, The World's Medicine Chest, available now at your favorite online bookstore. The World's Medicine Chest explores how America became the world's leader in biopharmaceutical innovation through market capitalism. But as Sally Pipes writes, America is the last best hope for millions around the world who are battling rare diseases and chronic conditions. As you'll read in the World's Medicine Chest, we can do more to fight and cure disease, but only if we continue to embrace private sector innovation over government regulation. Buy the World's Medicine Chest today at Amazon.com or your favorite online bookseller.
Well, I just want to add to that, Ben, that you got the brass ring. You got appointed to the State Board of Education. Governor Schwarzenegger appointed me to the Board of Governors for the California Community Colleges. And I think he wanted you to have all the fun. So.
And we're not on video, but I'm assuming you said fun in air quotes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Better you than me, Ben.
There you go.
So, Ben, you and Lance both have mentioned California Teachers Association a few times now. And, I don't think it's a stretch to say that they're, the most powerful advocacy group in the state. I mean, I think you could maybe come up with one or two other organizations that rival their power, but they're certainly in the running. One thing that I notice when I talk to people who aren't in politics, when I talk to them about teachers' unions and the influence of teachers' unions on public policy, is it just sounds like a very sympathetic group. Who wouldn't want teachers, who most of us love, who wouldn't want teachers to be well compensated and taken care of and have a well-organized ability to talk to or influence public policy? But judging by what you and Lance have said, and certainly my own experience, it doesn't always work out that way. I mean, can you speak to just the level of influence that the California Teachers Association has and other teachers unions, and maybe talk about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, or where you sort of draw the line there?
Yeah, and I think that this is an interesting conversation because I suspect that I may have a different kind of ideological and partisan perspective than the two of you all have on this. In that, I'm a longtime partisan Democrat. I consider myself to be a big government liberal. I just think that the purpose of big government is to serve people, not public employee unions or other special interest groups. There are certainly areas of public policy where I strongly agree with the teachers union. I do think that we need to invest more money into the education system. I think teachers should be better compensated and they should be protected. And I think it's even good for teachers to be unionized. I just think that it's also good for all adults in the system to, at some level, be accountable for how well kids do in the system. And so I have a lot of sympathy for teachers' unions. And, I mean, I was a paid staffer on the Kamala Harris campaign, even though the teachers' unions were strongly supporting her. And I have literally, not figuratively, sued Kamala Harris when she was Attorney General. She was the named defendant in the Vagara education civil rights litigation. And so, there are plenty of areas where I have common cause with the teachers' unions, beginning with my opposition to the Trump administration. All that being said, the teachers' union, as you all well know, is the most powerful lobbying force in California. They spend more money on lobbying than all the oil companies, tobacco companies, and chemical companies combined. And what do they do with that power and influence? A lot of it is spent on defending a wildly indefensible status quo. In Los Angeles, the teachers union, UTLA, was on the front lines of keeping our schools closed during COVID. My daughters, during the COVID shutdown, were both LAUSD students, and they didn't go to school for a year and a half. And during that year and a half, we had the teachers union, the president of the LA Teachers Union, declaring that there was no such thing as learning loss, that it was somehow like a great thing that our kids were learning what an insurrection was, and that was somehow enough. Saying, I'm Jewish, saying crazy things about Jews in Israel, and doing little to nothing at all about the generational learning loss that has set back an entire generation of children, including my daughters. And so it's a somewhat complicated answer for me about, the how to kind of analyze the role that the teachers union plays in California politics, because I do think that there's certainly an appropriate role for them to play. California politicians are, for the most part, wildly intimidated by the teachers union. And, the constituency for radical kids first reforms, like the kind that Lance has been advocating for his entire career, for like the state senator who told me that he sees schools as big buildings filled with people who can't vote for him. That dude isn't going to, run through a brick wall to do the right thing for kids, just because of transactional politics. So, I think the teachers union in California in particular plays a highly problematic role, and is at least somewhat responsible for the status quo that we find ourselves in, including the generational learning loss that our kids suffered. Like, that was a policy choice that politicians adhere to with the ardent backing of California teachers unions.
That's a great answer. I've battled the teachers unions on various fronts over the years, just like, you've had to, go up against them. And, I think that, what strikes me is that, Americans often will say that they don't want to see all this division, and they want to see, both sides kind of coming together and, working on things, at least where there's common ground. And I think that really, if you want to see where that type of work actually happens, it's actually in the education reform movement.
Yeah.
Because here, you've said that you're a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I'm, probably a few steps more conservative than you are on a lot of issues. But, you and I have been in the trenches together working on all these common issues and for many years. And that's not an anomalous instance, right? There are lots of people who are like you, lots of people who are like me, but we've all come together to work on these issues to try and improve the education of our kids. But you've said, as a strong Democrat, that that you're disappointed in some of the positions of the Democratic Party with regard to education. And given that, as in your last answer, the strength of the teachers union with regard to the Democratic Party, how would you reset the politics of education policies within the Democratic Party? And what do you think really needs to happen?
That's a great question, Lance. I mean, my first job was working on Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign, and then working in his White House. Since then, I've been a paid staffer on 5 Democratic presidential campaigns, including the Kamala Harris campaign. I spent the last 2 months of the campaign traveling around the country with Tim Walz. And at the same time, as you know, Lance, I think we met when I was a deputy mayor for Reardon. I've been a deputy mayor for a moderate Republican governor, and I've been a state board of education appointee for a moderate Republican governor. I don't feel at all like that is contradictory. And I say that in part because, the parent trigger law passed, like I said earlier, by literally one vote in both houses of the California legislature. And the political formula for that was every single Republican in California voted for it, single Republican legislator, and just enough Democrats of color representing districts with impacted kids to win by one vote. And then it was signed by a moderate Republican governor. And I should say, stepping back, that was all made possible because of President Obama's Race to the Top initiative, which I'm sure remember. That was a progressive Democratic president who would be quite values aligned on a conversation like this, as would Bill Clinton. That wasn't that long ago. I mean, Lance, we're not that old, but it feels like a million years ago. It feels like an utter impossibility today to assemble a political coalition like that. And I should also say that that coalition included LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, lots of other progressive Democrats, and that coalition today would not be possible. And so, what needs to happen is, and again, we made agree to disagree on this, but as much as I ardently disagree with Kamala Harris on the issue of education, I was quite devastated by November's election results and have since been even more devastated. I happen to think that America should be a member of NATO. I happen to agree with Ronald Reagan that Russia is an evil empire. And watching what is happening every day in Washington, D.C. is truly heartbreaking for me, not just as a Democrat, but as an American. But the only lemonade that I have been able to squeeze out of the many lemons that we have today in our body politic is that I do think that there is oxygen for a conversation about what it means to be a progressive when it comes to education. And for the last decade plus, progressives like myself within the Democratic Party who are values aligned on the basic issue that all children should have a right to a quality public education, there just wasn't a lot of room for that conversation. And, to the extent that there was, the conversations would go something like this. Hey, Mr. Democratic politician who quietly agrees on this issue, you and I both know that it's the right thing to do for kids. This is a moral issue. We also know that the politics on this are pretty effed within the Democratic Party. So just do the right thing anyways, because we know it's the right thing. And, I don't have to tell you that is a pretty flawed theory of change if you're talking about building a political movement. The conversation today is quite different. It's, hey, status quo defenders within the Democratic Party, all of us got on board for the sake of democracy, Ukraine, whatever your issue is. And here we are. So now it's time for you to shut the F up. And we're going to have a conversation, not about just doing the right thing for kids, even though it is about doing the right thing for kids. We're going to have a conversation about how to win back working class voters in the ironically named states of the blue wall. And part of that is they want quality schools for their kids. They want good education options for their kids. They want non-college options for their kids. These are issues that Democrats like President Obama and President Clinton, Democrats who win, used to talk about all the time. Democratic Party used to be the party of public education. I was traveling on the campaign. Kamala and Governor Walz, they talked about choice and freedom in every speech. I was there for a lot of them, but never about schools. So now there's, I think, a moment where we can reset that conversation and redefine what it means to be a progressive when it comes to public education. And I think in the kind of 1.0 of Trump resistance, which I was also very much a part of, the impetus amongst progressives was just to resist. In my opinion, that is necessary, but pretty far from sufficient. And, Democrats and progressives need to tell a story about what an alternative future looks like. I think quality public schools for all children should be a big part of that story. Last thing I'll say on this is that I don't know if you all have been following the debate that Ezra Klein is driving around an abundance agenda, but I think this very much fits into that context. It's his critique of the Democratic Party has been that we are a party of big government, but a party of big government for the sake of big government, not a party of big government that holds big government accountable for delivering for the people. And, his main critique has been around housing and climate, which I agree with. But, I think in a lot of ways, education is exhibit A for that argument.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I still remember, I don't know, 4 years ago maybe, Ezra Klein wrote a column in the New York Times basically saying, I think the headline was California is making progressives squirm, and just kind of highlighting how kind of everything you just said, where, California is supposed to be this big progressive state that's solving all the problems of the government. Maybe that's a bit of an oversimplification of California's persona, but and then saying that it was not really meeting its own expectations. So I'm glad you brought that up. That just made me think about that. But it is kind of interesting because, as you pointed out, education policy is one of those areas where, we just aren't, no matter what we're being told, it just doesn't seem to match up with reality. We're running a little bit low on time, but I know that you had brought this up a few times, and obviously want to give you some time to talk about what you're currently working on. And you had mentioned it, a constitutional right to a quality education. And that's, as a sentence, it's a very complicated idea. And can you talk about kind of where that idea came from, how it would work in practice, how you would even measure a quality education, especially in view of the potential of grade inflation, social promotion, and the de-emphasis of standardized testing? And would you measure quality education in terms of a static snapshot of school performance, or is there a way to measure growth in school performance? And I realized that I just asked you, in saying I had one question, I just asked you 12. But can you just kind of in general sort of, what's the vision here? What are you going for? And how is it that you would not be creating a situation where any upset parent could just start suing the school board for any reason?
Yeah, all good and the right questions. I mean, and I'm happy to answer all 27 of them. But before I before I do, I mean, I think it's worth noting that none of these questions are currently being debated because nobody needs to. That in California and in every other state in the nation, parents have a right to a free public education, but they have no rights whatsoever to any level of educational quality. The kind of backstory for my entry point into that theory of change is after working on the parent trigger law, I referenced this a little while ago, but I ended up suing then Attorney General Kamala Harris in an impact litigation case called Vergara versus the state of California. And in that, we effectively helped 9 children sue the state of California to basically make the argument that because the quality of education they were receiving was so poor that it was literally violating their constitutional rights. long story short, we presented a powerful case and won at the lower court level. And in that victory, it created, through impact litigation, a right to quality public education for all kids in California. Then Attorney General Kamala Harris, at the behest of the California Teachers Association, appealed that case up to the Supreme Court. And the case that she made, or her attorneys made at the court, was that she conceded that we had proven that children were being harmed by the system because we presented so much overwhelming data, and it was just impossible to argue against. But her argument was that because the Constitution did not include an explicitly articulated right to quality public education, that children basically didn't have a right, and we lost. The court on a 4-3 decision overturned the lower court decision. So after that, I embarked on a Sisyphusian journey to rewrite the Constitution in California and in other states to explicitly articulate a right to quality public schools or quality public education, so that wouldn't happen again. In the midst of that, the COVID pandemic happened. Our schools got shut down. And about a year into the school shutdown in Los Angeles, parents actually sued the district. This was not widely reported. Matt, I think you wrote about it a little bit in your piece. Parents sued the district, and the parents literally just raised money through a GoFundMe page. I was part of that, and so they raised enough money to sue the district and to make the district reply, but they ran out of money to go all the way to court. But in the district's reply, they kind of said the quiet part out loud. They said literally that because students in California do not have a right to quality public education, and they cited the Vergara Supreme Court case, they said that the LUSD doesn't have any legal obligation to provide a quality public education, and parents in LAUSD don't have any standing to ask them to reopen schools or ask them to do anything else. That we get what we get and we don't get upset. And that is the status quo for every parent and every child in California and every parent and every child in America right now. The idea behind establishing quality public education or quality public schools as an actionable civil right, the first piece of that analysis, Lance, is that all of the questions that you asked suddenly are no longer theoretical. They're actually debates that we have to have as a society. And I think that just in and of itself is healthy. Now, how would it operationalize? It would, work differently in different states. The state that's not a state that is the closest to advancing this theory of change right now is Washington, D.C., as a city, which is, has quasi-state-like status. The State Board of Education is currently debating it. It's being sponsored by the president of the State Board of Education. His name is Jacques Patterson. It's only one sentence long. It's an amendment that says that I think it's the district and DCPS, DC Public Schools, shall provide all public school students with high quality public schools, defined as schools that equip students with the tools to participate meaningfully in our economy, our society, and our democracy. That's the entire amendment. And it would create an actionable civil right to high quality public schools. And, in terms of some of the questions you asked, Lance, in terms of how this would operationalize, how it wouldn't result in a kind of storm of litigation, one piece of that is that it establishes a right to high quality public schools as opposed to high quality public education. And that is intentionally drafted to convey to future courts that this is essentially a right around, it's not an individual right to litigate individual problems if a kid doesn't like their teacher or doesn't make the soccer team. It's a right really around collective action. And a high quality public school is not a perfect public school. My daughters both go to a high quality public school that they complain about all the time. And so one problem or a couple of problems is not evidence of a low quality public school. But if only 15% of kids are reading at grade level, it's pretty hard to make the case that that school is equipping students with the tools to participate meaningfully in our economy, meaning get a good job, our society, meaning socially and emotionally regulated in a multi-ethnic society, or our democracy, democracy, be informed voters and active citizens. If you can't read, can't do many of those things. And in terms of how it would operationalize in your question, one way it could operationalize is by looking at similarly situated kids at similarly situated schools. And the way that would potentially at least work, and I should say this is all uncharted territory because it's never been done before. But the way it could conceivably work based on case law and other areas of public policy is right now, if you have a district school or a charter school that's hitting it out of the park with a particular demographic of kids, I don't have to tell you, Lance, that more often than not, that's just the way it stays forever. That you have these, islands of success in a sea of mediocrity. If that sentence were part of the California Constitution today, it would mean that the kids at the lower performing schools that are similarly situated to the school that's hitting it out of the park could go to court and say, hey, we have a right to a high quality public education. You've now proven with similarly situated kids, similar resources, that you can achieve X results for kids. And we're stuck in this school over here getting Y results along with all these other kids at all these other schools. And we want that. And a court would be unlikely to be prescriptive to tell a district or a state what to do or how to educate kids. But what a court could do is say, okay, district, you have now proven that you can achieve this level of results. So either scale what's already working to all these other kids who would benefit, or find some even better way to bring all these other kids up to similar results. But you can no longer do nothing. It's no longer constitutional to do nothing. Is today doing nothing is just business as usual. But under this civil rights framework, doing nothing would become a civil rights violation. And I mean, Lance, I think you and I would probably agree that there should be civil rights violations all over the state of California for the quality of education that we're providing our children. But it's just business as usual, generation after generation, because there is no reason politically for it not to be.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that both parties agree that the biggest civil right that we're fighting for right now is the right for kids to receive a quality education, and for them to then take that quality education and then succeed in life. Which kind of brings to one of the last questions we have, and I love doing a podcast because we can use words like Sisyphean.
That's right. Yeah, that's words like that are though probably one of the reasons why Democrats are cast as elitist in the blue wall. So I'm probably not doing my party any favors.
Well, I love that word. I actually use that word myself. But you and I have been pushing that boulder up the mountain for a long time, Ben, and which kind of brings me to kind of reference to what I mentioned earlier. So what can Republicans and Democrats do to work together to improve education and get that boulder up to the top of the mountain?
It seems kind of crazy to me that the concept of all children getting the education they deserve for the future they need, why in the world would that be a partisan issue? It didn't used to be. And, if you look at the history of presidential politics, you could make an argument that the modern education reform movement started with Ronald Reagan and the Nation at Risk report in the early 80s. The baton got passed to my old boss, Bill Clinton, who ran on charter schools and school accountability as part of his new democratic brand. George W. Bush picked that up with No Child Left Behind, that had good pieces and bad pieces, but it was a continuation of Clinton's Goals 2000 initiative, which was the first attempt to kind of have nationalized standards. Barack Obama picked that up, and with his Race to the Top initiative, which was the singular reason why the parent trigger law passed. And since then, we've kind of lost the thread, but it's really worth understanding the deeply bipartisan nature of education policymaking in California for much of our lifetimes. And that the current status quo, where both parties have kind of gone to their corners and taken their marbles and walked away, is anomalous. It's not normal. and we can find our way back to that place where, we can do values-based policymaking, not partisan policymaking. And as I said, the parent trigger law, as much as I am like a partisan Democrat, my job in the White House was working in the White House Political Affairs Office. It was to use the resources of the White House to get Democrats elected. I did quite a bad job of that, by the way, because I worked there during the 1994 elections when Newt Gingrich got elected. But all that being said, my entire background was in partisan politics, but the parent trigger law passed with unanimous Republican support, was supported by a Republican governor and just enough Democrats to win by one vote. That seems like science fiction today, but it isn't that far removed historically, and it's within our grasp in the future. And I think as Democrats are reflecting in a much needed way on this issue and others in terms of what it means to be a progressive in this moment in time, a piece of that is finding common ground with values-aligned Republicans, of which there are many. And so, it seems to me that Democrats and Republicans, if we can't find common ground on this issue, we're pretty screwed, because I don't know what else is kind of lower hanging fruit. But, at the end of the day, kids aren't born as Democrats or Republicans. They're just kids, and, they're just Americans. And, we all have a stake in an educated electorate and an electorate that is able to kind of realize their best selves. And, the American education system as it is today is setting us up for the politics that we get today, which is, in my opinion, pretty effing brain dead.
Well, on that note, we have an uplifting question here at the end. I honestly, Ben, it is a heavy topic, and I appreciate you coming out and speaking with Lance and I, and I think covered a lot of really good ground today. So we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy over a great glass of California wine. So what beer, wine, cocktail, or other beverage, and it can be non-alcoholic, are you enjoying these days that you recommend to our listeners?
Well, that's funny. I don't drink, and so I am I'm a frequenter of Burning Man, which is a kind of a libertarian utopia in a lot of ways, and so I may or may not partake in other substances that in beverage form, and I think in these pretty wacky times we're living in, maybe it's time to kind of turn the volume up and on substances beyond alcohol. So that's it's a roundabout answer, but I'm going to stick with it.
I appreciate Ben, I would have said Diet Coke, but yeah.
All right, yeah, I'm going to say Diet Coke, and because we're a podcast, I may or may not be using air quotes.
Ben, I was just going to tell you, I'm the only teetotaling Catholic in the country, so I know where you're coming from.
Thanks.
So I always say that I take my chocolate milk straight.
There you go. We can do maybe a chocolate milk Diet Coke cocktail together.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on today and speaking with us. I really appreciated it. Good luck with all your efforts trying to reshape the debate on public education and securing a right to a quality education. Good luck with that, and we appreciate you coming out. Thank you so much.
It's a lot of fun. Thanks a lot to both of you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.